Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are looking at chapter 8, Life in the Trenches with Henry Barrie, Vimy Ridge survivor. After the hour ride across the canal to Calais, France, Henry and 30 other men got on the train taking them to Havre, France. Henry passed through Dieppe and made his way to Havre, where he was told he was taking the rail to Amiens and then marching to Bouzencourt near Albert, where the 38th Battalion was located. The next day, Henry and the other 30 men arrived at headquarters on the front line and were told what to expect by their sergeant. The battalion has been fighting the Germans for the past 4 months here in the Somme. We've lost over 50% of our men, which is why you are here now. We are expecting to attack one more time before winter comes. You must remember that the Germans are only 1,000 feet away from you in their trenches. We've been shooting the heavy artillery around the clock at them in preparation for the attack. You will see that the Germans have a lot of airplanes flying over us right now, and our pilots are doing the best they can to fight them. Be sure and keep your head down. The German snipers have been extremely active, especially you. The sergeant pointed to Henry and said, "You're pretty tall for the trenches. Never take your helmet off. Do you understand?" Henry answered, "Yes, sir." The sergeant said, "What type of accent is that? Are you Canadian?" Henry answered, "Yes, sir, from Watson's Corner, sir." The sergeant grunted and said, "Well, glad to have you here. We certainly need good men." As Henry walked with his head down through the maze of trenches, following his lance corporal, he could not believe the noise. The booming guns seemed to vibrate right through his entire body. Occasionally, he would hear an airplane screaming by and making a rat-a-tat-tat sound, but it was the mud that made the biggest impression on Henry. Everywhere you turned, there was mud. He would keep walking by muddy men staring aimlessly right ahead, not even acknowledging his presence. He would see broken shovels, discarded tins, rats running through the trenches, and occasionally a big hole in the side of the trench. As he continued walking and the booming lessened, the talking stopped, and the lance corporal raised his index finger to his mouth. Henry and the 30 men walked silently, tiptoeing along where they could hear voices. Henry thought, "That doesn't sound like English. What is that?" And then he realized he was hearing the German language. Suddenly, they arrived at their trench. The lance corporal came over to an officer who greeted all of them. He said, "We have just received our orders. In 36 hours at 610, we will be going over the top and attacking the German trench. Our artillery will be bombing non-stop between now and then. The 87th Battalion is on our right and East Surrey is on our left. Your objective is to take the trench directly in front of us. If you fail to advance or try to come back to this trench, you will be shot on sight. Do you understand?" Henry and the rest of the battalion nodded. As he looked around with his new battalion, he recognized some of the men from that recruiting day in Perth that he had trained with in Valcartier and West Sandling. He nodded to them and they nodded back with grim smiles. The officer continued, "Make sure your rifles are clean. Otherwise, they will jam in this mud and you will be weaponless. Try to get some sleep. You'll need it." That night, Henry read his Bible and started his prayers. "Dear God, please watch over Jimmy and keep me safe. Give me the courage to face the enemy and not let my pals down." The next day and night, Henry sat in the trench, watching the rats run through and covering his ears due to the explosions landing just beyond him. He kept looking up and covering his head every time another shell went whistling by, wondering if the next one would land in their trench. One of the veteran soldiers turned to him and said, "Yes, sometimes the shells do land here. 2 weeks ago, our battalion got bombed for 2 days by our guns until they figured out they were bombing the wrong trench. You are better off waiting in the dugout. It's quieter there with more protection. Hopefully you won't get buried, though, by the shells." Henry replied, "Thank you," and stood up. The soldier quickly replied, "Get your head down. It won't do you any good getting shot in the head before the attack." Henry ducked his head and made his way to the dugout, thanking God he was still alive. The next morning, the lance corporal quietly woke up the men in the dugout and said, "Let's go. The attack starts in 1 hour." As Henry stood in line behind the ladder, preparing to go over the top of the trench, the lance corporal reminded him, "Take care of the barbed wire and stay on the duckboards. The first 3 men will cut the wire and lead the way. Don't be in a hurry. If you fall off the duckboards into the mud or get caught on the wire, you will be an easy target for the machine guns. Take your time and follow the battalion. If you see someone go down, don't stop. We will get them later after we achieve our objective. And remember, for God, King, and country, do us proud." As Henry looked at the other men, he knew he could do this. He had come here to fight for his country's freedom and for his family. He knew the men in front and back of him would not fail him, and he couldn't fail them. And with that thought, he went over the top. As Henry came out of the trench, he suddenly realized it was completely silent. There were no guns booming, no shells exploding, no winds blowing, no birds chirping. Nothing but a cold November 18 morning. Henry started to shiver and suddenly heard a rat-a-tat-tat sound. He could see light explosions coming from the trench directly in front of them, and he instinctively ducked his head. He looked for cover and realized there was none. The man in front of him suddenly fell without a sound, and Henry felt a sense of fear he had never felt before. He thought, "Just keep moving forward. God is watching over me. Just get to the trench in front of me." But then he realized everyone had stopped. Henry looked and saw everyone was waiting for the cutting team to cut the barbed wire fence. He watched men of the team fall down and not get up. Other men rushed forward and continued cutting the wire. Henry went into a crouch and started firing at the lights in front of him and prayed, "God, please let them cut the wire. Keep me safe." Finally, the cutting team got through and the entire battalion rushed forward, laying duckboards as they went over the 200 feet to the German trench. Henry leaped into the trench, and to his amazement, there were no Germans to be found anywhere. They walked up and down the trench and discovered all the tunnels had been collapsed, so the battalion stopped. Men were immediately sent to work on digging a tunnel back to their trench, which took the rest of the day. However, when Henry looked back at the ground they had just ran over, he could not believe the number of men lying on the ground. He tried to count them and stopped after he counted 200 men. The next day, after the working parties got a couple more tunnels ready, the sergeant called for the roll call. The sergeants went through and started counting all the privates. When they got to the end, the commanding officer said, "We are currently missing 7 officers. We're going to need 3 search parties to find their bodies." 30 privates were named, including Henry. As they prepared to go back out onto the duckboards after the sun went down, Henry realized it was a bright full moon with every hole and tree easily seen. Henry prayed, "Jesus, this could be really bad. Please keep me safe." After searching all night, with men being killed to the left and right of him, and a close call with a shell, and 3 officers found and brought back, Henry crawled back into the trench exhausted, cold and wet. The next day, the battalion headed back to the reserve trenches where they would get a bit of break. However, the guns started up again, and Henry found it difficult to sleep. After a week of this, the battalion received new recruits and made their way to the billets in Albert, stopping first at the hospital to drop off all the sick soldiers. By this time, Henry had quite the fever. He couldn't get warm, shivering all the time, looked exhausted, and coughing constantly. He was left at the hospital, where he was immediately sent to the hospital in Rouen, France. After 3 weeks of recovery, Henry finally started to feel better and was sent to the recovery hospital. After a few days lying in bed, thinking constantly about everything he had seen, Henry remembered the diary Jimmy had given him. Henry thought, maybe, if I write this down, it will help me stop thinking about it. As the nurse walked by, Henry asked, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you have a pencil I could borrow? I would like to do some writing." The nurse replied, "Sure. Do you need some paper as well?" Henry said, "Yes, I would like to write a letter home." December 26, 1916. Dear Mother and Father, just a few lines to let you know I'm still in the hospital, but up and around. It's the day after Christmas here and thought Christmas wouldn't be up to much this year, but I was wrong. When I woke up that morning, I had a sock hanging on the end of my bed, and in it was firecrackers, toothbrush, cigarettes, butterscotch candy, and chewing gums. Then the sisters served us chicken, bread, jelly, some of the nicest I had ever tasted, and lots of cakes. Cakes with oranges, nuts, chocolates, cigars, and even one that said Merry Christmas. You might think that because there was no one there that I knew that it wouldn't be much, but a fella gets used to that and gets to know them a little and hates to see them go away. The best part was the 4 letters you sent, and I was more than pleased to hear from you and know that you're all doing well. I haven't got to see Auntie in England yet, but I hope to do soon. Well, I think I'll close for now, hoping you had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Your loving son, Henry. So, a couple things to be aware of here. First of all, it's important to recognize just how close the trenches were and how small what was known as no man's land was. As you can imagine, 1,000 feet was really all that separated initially the trenches between the two sides. If you're at St. Emily's, to give you an idea how long 1,000 feet is, that would be as if we were in the bus lane and the Germans were on the other side of the park. And when they actually did their attack, they were within 200 feet of each other, which is the length of the building of our school. So again, if you were, for example, in Mrs. Reed's class and you were wanting to go down to the K1 class, that's approximately 200 feet and gives you an idea of just how far a distance it was between the two groups. The letter that you saw at the end, that was actually the letter. That's actually the letter that Henry wrote. And as you can tell, having news between he and his family was very sparse. In fact, that letter was the first communication that had existed between his family and him in the time that he had left. And he had been gone for just over a year at that point when he received that letter. And so the 4 letters that got to him were in just that time. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow.